Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and as always, I am happy to be with you on this Tuesday for another book interview, author interview, excuse me. Today I am speaking with author Katie Burke about her new book, Urban Playground: What Kids Say About Living in San Francisco. Have you ever wondered what it's like being a kid in San Francisco? Are you raising a kid in this or another urban center? San Francisco life is full of thrills and bummers, both for kids and the adults who love them. In Urban Playground: What Kids Say About Living in San Francisco, Katie Burke explores the experience of kids ages 5 to 9 living in this place. What makes San Francisco special for kids and why some are over it. Writer of Noe Kids, her column of kid profiles for San Francisco neighborhood newspaper The Noe Valley Voice, Katie Burke brings city kids' personalities and perspectives to the page, leading readers to see the joys and challenges inherent to being a San Francisco kid. Just when the book suggests that parks and ice cream are all any kid needs, you will turn the page to find a child's appreciation for the Golden Gate Bridge or the Ferry Building Farmers Market. But the picture isn't all aglow. The significant homeless population weighs on San Francisco children's hearts, and the city is too noisy for some. But for the most part, they will tell you it is a pretty great place to live. That's the description of Urban Playground: What Kids Say About Living in San Francisco. Again, the author is Katie Burke, and I had such fun with this book. It is written in short vignettes. Each chapter is a different story. They're only a few pages long, and then there are discussion questions at the end of each chapter. So there's actually three sections to each chapter. The first one is the interview with the child and a summary of that interview on a specific topic, and there are several different topics. For instance, when you grow up, what do you want your job to be? Where do you go on vacation? Who are your pets? Who is your hero, etc. So there is a summary of that conversation. Then there is a section called Insights from the Urban Playground, where Katie talks a little bit about San Francisco in the context of what she and the child talked about in their interview. And then there's discussion questions. So if you are reading this with a child, then there are discussion questions that you can read. Or if a child is reading it on his or her own, they can think about some of these things that maybe they haven't thought about. For me, I've mentioned before that I grew up in Montana, western Montana, in a pretty small town, population about 1,000. So for me, I really had no concept what an actual city was. I thought a quote-unquote city was going to visit my grandmother in what no one would call a city, but it was bigger than where I grew up. And I grew up 75 miles from the nearest fast food restaurant, etc. And so I think this would have been a really fascinating book. A book like this would have been fascinating for me as a kid, although it would have been almost as surreal maybe as reading like Little House on the Prairie. Little House on the Prairie might have seemed more realistic to me. I did read stories about kids that lived in bigger cities when I was growing up. And of course, I watched television and everything. But I think something like this, reading about children's experiences of, children of my own age or around my own age, would have been really interesting. Now, I have never lived in San Francisco, but I went to grad school in Berkeley. So I've lived in the Bay Area, and I've spent a lot of time in San Francisco, and I've spent time in San Francisco with family because when they have come to visit, I have taken them to San Francisco. And I actually would love to see what my Montana nieces would think about this this book and remembering their own experiences. So I have to tell you one story, and that is that my second niece, who is now 20, was fascinated with the Golden Gate Bridge when she was younger. Just fascinated with it. She was in love with a bridge that she had only seen on TV or on the internet. And she so wanted to go see the Golden Gate Bridge in person. So when I graduated from grad school, my parents were coming to Berkeley to celebrate and go to my graduation, and my niece's birthday just happens to be in May. The graduation was in May, and so they brought her along as a graduation gift. So she came to my graduation, which, she was bored to tears through, but she finally got to see the Golden Gate Bridge. She was so excited. Oh my gosh. So she was 8. She was 8 when she finally got to see the Golden Gate Bridge, and seeing San Francisco through her eyes was so much fun. And I think that's probably why I really enjoyed this book, obviously because I enjoy looking at the world through children's perspectives. That's always been something that I've been fascinated with, but also my own experiences of visiting San Francisco, of taking my nieces to San Francisco. I've actually taken 4 of my 5 nieces to San Francisco at some point in their lives, and we've done various different touristy things. So I have enjoyed that. But then to read what it's like to actually live there, and having never lived there myself, whether as an adult or a kid, I found it to be really fun. And there's so many parts in this book that made me smile. There's parts that made me go, wow, these kids have some really good insight. And there are other parts that made me think, wow, the opportunities that these children have growing up in this urban center are fascinating. So let's go ahead and turn to the interview now with Katie Burke. Again, the book is called Urban Playground: What Kids Say About Living in San Francisco. Katie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I am really excited to have you here to talk about your book, Urban Playground: What Kids Say About Living in San Francisco. Before we get to the book, though, if you could share a bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Sure. I live in San Francisco. I've lived here almost 21 years now. And let's see, I'm a writer since about 2004. I have a family law practice downtown. And I'm a very proud aunt to 6 nieces and 2 nephews.
You have me beat by 1 niece. I have 5 nieces. Actually,
you'll be beat by 1. It's the best.
You'll be beat by 1 nephew too. I have 1 nephew. So.
Okay. That's a joy, isn't it?
Yes. Unfortunately, they're all in Montana, but that's okay. Are your nieces and nephews close?
No, they're some are in Phoenix and some are in New York.
Oh, okay. So yeah, you have the same long distance auntie-hood. As I mentioned, the book is called Urban Playground, and the subtitle is What Kids Say About Living in San Francisco. Can you give an overview of the book?
Sure. I interviewed 50 San Francisco kids ages 5 to 9 at the time I interviewed them. And I interviewed them on any one of 10 possible topics, the topics being family, favorite foods, hero, favorite holiday, pets, school, sports, talents, vacation, or work. And they spoke to me about living in San Francisco through whatever lens their theme was about. And so this just writes up their profiles based on what they said, and then each profile is followed by 5 questions sparked by the interview that kids and their significant adults can go over together.
Right. So it's meant to be read either by, it could be read by any ages, but if you're reading it with, a child, grandchild, niece, nephew, then there are those questions at the end. What inspired you to put this collection together?
It was really my publisher's idea based on what I had written before. So I met my publisher at the San Francisco Writers Conference in 2018, and she did a panel presentation, And I went up to her afterward and said, I'd love to see you as a writing coach, because I knew that she offered those services. Because I had been debating for years, should I write a book? I don't know. Do I have the motivation? What would I write about? So I went to her to talk about those things. And then she saw that I had written, because I sent her some clips about living in San Francisco for many, many years. I had written about the city. And then in the past few years before I met her, I had started writing a column where I interviewed kids and took their profiles for a local paper here, and just some family stories for my nieces and nephews. So she put it together and said, I think you should be writing about kids in the city.
And I am so glad that suggestion was made, because it really is such a fun book. We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, more with Katie Burke. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Katie Burke about her delightful book, Urban Playground: What Kids Say About Living in San Francisco. Let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
And it's so much fun. I mean, the kids have such wonderful perspectives of the city and their lives in the city. There were several points where I was laughing at things that the kids said. I can only imagine how much fun it was for you to interview the children.
Yeah, I had to hold back laughter a lot of times. Yeah.
I bet. How were the children selected? You said that you interviewed 50, so how were they selected?
Yeah, I started just with who I knew. So there were a lot of people whose moms were lawyers, and, so it just started that way and just branched out in the city. And, diversity was important. So I just kind of told people what I was, I didn't turn down any interview. And our timeline was so fast that I did the 50. I mean, I would have done more if I'd needed to, but they all were great. I mean, the interviews all went really well. So everybody I interviewed is actually in the book, which wasn't my initial, I thought maybe I'll take 65 or 70 and pick the 50 best. But I loved them all. So yeah, it just kind of, a kid would have a great experience and they'd tell their friends at school, and then I'd get a call from one of those parents, and it went that way.
I did notice that several of the children, when they talked about soccer, were on the Vikings club. So I did notice that there were some crossover or some connections while I was reading.
Yes, and that's that club is a big deal here anyway. But yeah, that's right. That had some kids who were the same. I didn't mention any school names in the book on purpose, but if I had, you would have gone, oh, okay, this is a book about kids from this school. 'Cause a lot of people just told their friends, and that's how it happened.
Right. That's really fun, though. How much time did you spend speaking with each child on average?
The average interview was 45 minutes. I cut it off at an hour if it was ever going to go longer, which some of the little kids sometimes, probably could have gone for hours. There wasn't anything shorter than, I would say, 40 minutes, but 45 was the average.
That seems like a good length of time to get in some good questions and answers, and before they start to ramble or get distracted.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes with the little ones, closer to the age of 5, it's like, I'd get 20 minutes of play or them showing me this and that before they'd let me ask a question. So those were the ones that went longer because there was a lot more involved than just straight question answer. But yeah, it was. But even with the older ones, yeah, it was about 45 minutes because then they just have a lot to say.
Right. And the children are ages 5 through 9 in this book. I know, or I think I'm remembering correctly, that in the article that you write, the column that you write, the children's ages are a little
broader. So why did you decide for the book to make that age gap smaller from 5 to 9 rather than 4 to 12?
Yeah, I chose 5 to 9 for the book because I thought it would make sense to have a target age group. And I don't know if I necessarily thought this is the age of the kids who are going to read it, but I thought a book that had ages going all the way up to 12 would just kind of feel very disjointed. Whereas for my newspaper column, you're just reading one story per month, so it doesn't matter. But in a collection, I thought I should really have a tight age window. And so that's how that process was, how I decided that. And I just thought that age is so great, 5 to 9, because you get, you don't want to go too much younger than 5, or you get sort of like things you can't really use for a book. And then much older than 9, it's just a whole different level of cognition. So I just felt like those ages kind of fit together nicely.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier that there are specific categories that you ask them questions about. Did you have those categories ahead of time then?
I did. Yeah. So my publisher said she's really good at the format kind of thinking. You're going to want 50 kids, 10 categories, things kids care about. So favorite foods was an example she gave me. And then I just filled it in from there. What do kids care about? What are the things important in the life of a kid categorically? And I originally had, instead of holidays, I had getting bigger, because my nieces and nephews, if they lose a tooth, they want somebody FaceTiming me so they can show me. And, I feel like it's a really big deal for kids to get bigger. But when I was interviewing kids on that topic, it just kind of was a flop. Like, it just didn't really, not something they'd sit and opine about. So originally, this had also been a book about kids in U.S. cities. So I interviewed about, I think, 65 kids in cities around the U.S. through FaceTime mostly. And then my publisher called and said, they were really thinking, sales team was thinking you should really start in San Francisco since that's where you are. So we had to scratch those interviews. But the benefit of that is that I could change a few things, one of which was to yank the getting bigger topic and put in holidays.
Which I'm so glad you did, because that had some of my favorite parts in it.
Very inventive, I know.
Yeah, I made my parents listen to me read all of the made up holidays that the kids invented the other day.
Yeah, that was so fun. And every single one of those kids, it was just off the cuff. They did not have to think. It was like, how long have you been thinking about this?
Yeah.
Like you're on holiday.
I was trying to remember if I ever made up a holiday in my head when I was a kid, and I don't remember doing that, but maybe I did.
Yeah, I don't think I did.
It is time to go ahead and take another break. But I do have to tell one more niece story while we are on this subject of holidays. That really was my favorite part. And I really did force my parents to listen to me read the book to them. I don't know if I forced them. They're just as bigger readers as I am, and they love children just as much. But my nieces, again, and I, because I have lived away from home so much and for so much of my nieces' lives, I used to get really upset about missing so many holidays. And my mom and I started a tradition many, many years ago. It's been, it's been almost 20 years. Oh my gosh, it's been almost 20 years that we started this tradition, where one day when I was home on vacation, usually around Christmas time, but not always, sometimes in the summer, we would do holidays, and we would do all of the holidays in one day. So we would dye Easter eggs, not we and my mom and I, my mom and I and the kids, not just me and my mom. We would dye Easter eggs and hide them, and the kids could find them, and we would dress them up with face paint and they would go trick-or-treating at the 3 outside doors of my mom's house. We would do, those were 2 consistent ones that we always did, and then it kind of varied and evolved as years went by. Thanksgiving dinner, sometimes we'd do birthdays. We would just celebrate all of these holidays in miniature form throughout the day. It's exhausting, but it's a lot of fun and the kids love it. And the pictures crack me up because you'll have kids in face paint, Halloween face paint, holding up their birthday cupcakes or holding up their Easter eggs or standing in front of the Christmas tree or what have you. And it's so much fun. And I never thought about made up holidays, and I wonder what the kids would have come up with if we'd let them make up a holiday for Holidays Day. I'm not sure I actually want to know, but let's go ahead and take that break. We'll be right back. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Katie Burke. Before the break, we were talking about the children's favorite holidays and some of the holidays that they invented in their own heads. And let's go ahead now and turn back to that interview.
Do you have a favorite story or a favorite moment from the interview process?
I do. There was a little boy named Brad. He was either 8 or 9 when I interviewed him, and I always offered to go to the kid's home when I did the interviews. So in Brad's case, I went to his home, and so I did my interview with him, and he is just super smart. Let's see, I think his topic might have been work, and just super smart, just really great, interesting interview. And then when we were done, that one probably took about, Brad was 9 and his topic was school. Okay, page 89. So his might have been an hour, but, we went for a while. And then after we were done, he said, well, can I ask you some questions? And I said, sure. And he kept me another 45 minutes asking me, how do you write and what's your process for writing? And I was wondering, because I'm working on an essay for school and I'm really stuck on the opening paragraph. And, and he just went on and on and on wanting to talk about writing. And he was really sophisticated. He said, well, what are you going to do to sell your book? And I mean, it was just like this really funny conversation. Then finally his dad came in and said, okay, you've kept her long enough. Let her go.
That's awesome. That kid should have a podcast.
I know. Yeah, I was like, this kid is going places. Yeah, so that was just really fun.
I love that. It's pretty specific to, or not pretty specific, it is specific to San Francisco. You mentioned that you had interviewed other children, but then it got specific to San Francisco. So do you have a hope for what readers might take away from the book?
Yeah, when I wrote it, I was thinking, when we changed it to San Francisco, and we'll talk about this, but it was originally going to be different cities next anyway. So there'd be an Urban Playground Boston, Urban Playground Seattle. And the idea was that any child or adult who reads this book anywhere could really see into the life of a kid living in the city. So if you were living in a city, you could relate, but it's a different city from yours, and the city is really kind of a secondary character. It's not intended to be a guidebook of where to go necessarily, although there are some things in there, but it's really, what is the experience of a life of a kid in an urban center? So I had to be really thoughtful about, well, what's an urban center? I mean, you can call a lot of places a city, but to capture that feeling of, grid-like streets and walking to school in some cases, and, just sort of when you really think of what an urban center is, what that life is like. So really to see what that was like. And then also just a profile of kids, like I love to, in all my interviews that I do, and I do some interviewing of adults too and write profiles, I just like to really dive into who people are and what lights them up in their lives.
I think as a child, I would have been fascinated by a book like this because I grew up in Montana, in a town that is about 1,000 people. So to me, growing up, a city, there's not, I wouldn't say large, there are cities and what I would have considered big cities as a kid, but this would have been fascinating because it's a life that I couldn't really have imagined. So I would think that this would be really cool for kids living all types of places, whether they live in a different city or whether they live in a small town. I think it would be really fascinating for kids to read a book like this.
Yeah, I think so too. That's really interesting. I'm sure, growing up in Montana, you thought, oh, let's go to the big city. And then, you got out in the world as an adult, or whenever you saw something like New York or LA or, something. And yeah, it's just very different. And then cities are different from each other, so some of the feedback we've gotten from the book, from people, I guess they call them bookstagrammers, people who are influential about books on Instagram, they're really all over the country. And a lot of them have said, oh, this is so interesting. I mean, we live in a small town, but it's so fun to give my kid this portal into, city life.
Yeah, I mean, and you said it's not really intended to be a guidebook, but it's kind of in a way. I mean, like, I think it would be fun to read if a family was planning on going to a city, to read this beforehand to see what children enjoy about that city. Maybe choose a few things from a book like this that they would want to see. You mentioned other cities, so is this going to be a series? And if so, what city is next?
Yeah, that is so up in the air right now. I mean, if you'd asked me 3 months ago, it would have been a different answer. But originally, the idea was very originally it was U.S. cities and then go city by city. And then we changed it. So the first one would be San Francisco, and then a different city next, and then a different city after that. And I would either, I don't know that I would have necessarily traveled for the interviews. I could have done them by FaceTime as I did in the beginning. But that was the original idea. And then here comes coronavirus. And I started thinking, the wisdom of talking to kids about their city when all they're seeing is, their living room couch doesn't really, that's not what we would be talking about, or, what their lives are about right now.
Right.
So what I was thinking about for the next step was, kids in COVID-19. So, what are their thoughts about the coronavirus? What questions do they have? What are their lives like sheltering in place? So that's been rolling around my head. I've actually done about a dozen interviews on that topic with kids in San Francisco, some of them who are already in the book and some not. And, and then the George Floyd murder happened, and I thought maybe it should be about kids and race, so I feel like it's really right now a very evolving thing. I mean, Urban Playground, my intention is that it will go on and it will be about kids in cities, but whether it's really about any more, the life in the city. I mean, all these cities have changed so much just overnight.
Absolutely. Are you still writing your weekly column, and are these topics that you're writing about in that column, like, the COVID-19, all the protests that are going on around the country right now?
Yes, it's a monthly column, so there hasn't been that much yet, but definitely the kids I've spoken to since coronavirus and sheltering in place, we have talked about that, about what do they miss from school, those kinds of things. That's because so the Noe Valley Voice is the paper, and it's a neighborhood newspaper here. And typically I just talk to them about anything. And in fact, I've taken my questions from the book and started to use them for my column, even though the column predates the book. but they get multiple themes. I ask them about a lot of things. So since the coronavirus started, I've been asking them about that, and that's been featured in their columns. And then I haven't interviewed anybody since George Floyd, but for sure that will come up too, because there are protests all over the city, and including Noe Valley. So yes, I mean, it's still profiles of kids, but now it's very topical for the day.
Sure, which I think is smart because, you know, you don't want to try to force them to talk about things that aren't really relevant to the, you know, if you're trying to just talk specifically about living in a city and their city, A, they're sheltered in place, and B, their city is having protests, you know, that's going to be foremost on their mind.
Right.
Yeah. You are a lawyer also, so how did this type of writing come about alongside you? I'm sure you write as a lawyer, but how did you start writing articles, columns, and then eventually this book?
Yeah, and it's a good word, alongside, because it has been, they've really dovetailed. I graduated law school in 2002, and I started writing in 2004. And, you know, in the beginning, I had all these dreams of, you know, the writing will prevail and that'll be my life. And, you know, throughout all the years, there've been many, many twists and turns and sometimes they traded off. I mean, sometimes I took a break from law and did writing and then went back to practicing. But for the most part, they have existed side by side. And I've just carved out a really particular writing life for myself that, you know, in the beginning, people would hear, oh, you're a writer, you should write for this legal journal about family law news or, you know, this or that. So I would sort of do things like that and think, but that's not what I mean when I say I'm a writer. And I've been going to writers' conferences for years and years and years. And then just slowly over the years, I've developed it more where they just have a coexistence with each other, the law practice and the writing. And now people who know me, you know, would be just as inclined to introduce me as a writer as they would as a lawyer. And I just make time for both. I mean, last year was crazy because I was running the law practice while writing the book on a very hastened timeline. I don't think I'll do it that way again. But I definitely now, I mean, they have equal weight in my life in terms of importance. And no longer do I say, well, one pays more, so I have to pay more attention there. Really now it's more like, well, which one is the most pressing on me this week? And what do I need to, you know, which one do I need to kind of lessen a little bit to make room for the other?
That's wonderful. Do you find it hard to maintain that balance at times, or have you kind of worked that out for yourself?
You know, the time when I found it the hardest, well, the time I found it the very hardest was writing this book, because I really did have to just put the pedal on the gas with the book some weeks. And then that was fine for the practice because I have my own practice, so I could just not take new cases or, you know, I mean, it worked out fine in terms of the balance for the practice, but for my life, I worked 7 days a week, all day, every day, which is just not my thing. I like my leisure time. So the other thing that I would say used to be hard for me and is not anymore is treating the writing with its due. So I used to it's like, oh yeah, okay, so on Tuesday morning I'll write this, and then Tuesday morning would come, or Monday evening, and I would say, no, I don't have time to do that. I've got something for the law practice. And because the law practice pays more, the writing would get pushed aside. And now I've realized you could just do that your whole life and then you never write a thing. So I just don't do that at all anymore. I mean, there are weeks when certain things are necessary. But for the most part, it doesn't matter that one pays more. That's how I keep it in balance, is when I remember that.
I always love hearing how people manage to balance two maybe seemingly disparate parts of their lives and make it work. Obviously, I interview a lot of authors, and so I talk to them about how they balance writing with other parts of their lives, whether they have another full-time job or whether that's parenting or what have you. But I am always fascinated by it and comforted by it that there are people out there who have that balance and who find ways to make it work. Not that it's always easy, but they do find ways to make it work. So let's go ahead and take our last break of the podcast. And when we come back, Katie's advice to aspiring authors. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Katie was speaking about how she was able to find balance between her law practice and writing. So now we are going to go ahead and get back to the interview with her advice for aspiring authors.
So out of your experience then, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Yes, I do. I deliberated for 16 years about whether I was going to write a book. And I think in many times during that time, I thought, well, I must not want to write one or I would be doing it. And what I learned was as soon as, my publisher began as my writing coach and she had this vision and then she said, why don't we put you on the publishing contract or put you on a publishing schedule and have you sign a contract? And as soon as she did that, I was able to take it seriously and self-motivate. Well, it wasn't self-motivating. She motivated me. So the first piece of advice I would have, because looking back, I realized, and I don't regret a thing for my own past, but I do realize that if there's any part of you at all who thinks you want to write, you do have to explore it. And I definitely did. I mean, I didn't sit there and wonder. I mean, I went to writers' conferences. I wrote whole manuscripts and then scrapped them. So I was definitely on that path. But definitely, I mean, what I said before, especially now, I mean, with the pandemic, what has been really clear to me is I am so glad I did that. I am so glad I met my publisher when I did, because life moves on. And, what I really would stress to people is sit down and write and trust that it'll go somewhere, because when I connect the dots looking backward, everything I did in the writing world, I mean, everywhere, but really writing specific, everything I've done has led to the next thing. I mean, my publisher came up with this concept because she was looking at writing that I'd been doing as far back as 2004, and it was so obvious to her. I never would have come up with this, but it was really obvious to her because I had clips and I had things I'd done. So even someone else can show you who you are if you just do it. Someone said to me once, I believe that what you do every day will be faithful to you. And he's a poet who wakes up every morning at 6 a.m. to write a poem. He's also a lawyer, which is how I know him. And I think about that all the time because my writing has been incredibly faithful to me. And it won't feel like that every moment. It's just in looking back that it's like, oh yeah, I've got 16 years of work that people can look back on.
And I think you bring up a really good point. Often, I think people envision writers as being very solitary, very isolated, and that is true to a point. But most authors I talk about the writing community and how helpful it is to have people who understand what you do and who can, not only critique your work, but also encourage you and help you to maybe get over those difficult points where you're not quite sure what direction you're going.
Right. And introduce you to people and make things happen. I mean, I'm getting on a call later today with a friend whom I met because we have a mutual friend who said, hey, you got into publishing your book. Can you talk to my friend? So I did. And then it turns out she's going to be a great resource for me because we're going to keep each other motivated. So we're talking today. And that is so invaluable. I'm part of a writers co-op here where, we pay to be there and we can just go in there and write whenever we want to. But there's a community around it too. So in real life, we had monthly happy hours, which we're now doing on Zoom. And these are all published working writers in some form or another. A lot of us have other jobs too, but but we're all out there doing things in the world. So we all have really good connections for each other and ideas. And that's imperative. I mean, you can't sit at home and just write on a Microsoft Word document and never show it to anyone. I mean, that's not, I don't know that ever works. I mean, you do have to be in community and hear yourself speak and then have people reflect something back to you. That's exactly how my book happened.
Mm-hmm. When you take time to read for yourself, do you have favorite authors and genres?
I have favorite genres. I don't necessarily return to authors just because there are so many books to read. I would, but I love nonfiction. That is really my thing in writing and in reading. And I like fiction too if it reads really realistic. Like I don't do sci-fi or anything like that. So my favorite are narrative. I'm a journalist, so I like journalism. I mean, like right now, they're dark topics, but I'm reading them together. I usually only read one book at a time, but I kind of want to get this like dark subject over with. So I'm reading She Said, the story of Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey's, the two New York Times journalists who broke the Harvey Weinstein story, and another one called No Visible Bruises, and it's about domestic violence. And it's another journalist. I think she opens the book going to visit someone in Montana, actually, Rachel Louise Snyder. I have it right here on my hutch here. So they're both sort of investigative journalism, or maybe No Visible Bruises is feature journalism, but about violence against women in various ways. So I just thought I'm going to break my rule of reading one book at a time so I can just like get these two over with because they're very interesting, but it's time to be on to happier topics soon. But I do really like nonfiction. I like to learn about things. I love to follow a journalist's process, especially investigative journalism. So yeah, that's my favorite.
And I'm so nosy about what children are reading these days. So I always ask. So I'm going to ask you if you know. You have a great age range with your nieces and nephews. Do you know what they're reading right now? Anything that they've talked to you about?
Oh, Judy B. Jones. Is it Judy B. Jones? I think that's Junie B. Jones.
Junie. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. My let's see. She's 7 or she's 8. 7 or 8 year old niece in Phoenix loves the Junie B. Jones series. She loves to read them to me. And then, yeah, the kids really love series books. When I would interview kids for the books, a lot of them were reading books in a series. I'm not remembering any of the names offhand, but Junie B. Jones is a series, chapter books for sure, but serial chapter books I feel like are really big. I mean, they were when I was growing up too. So maybe they're timeless or maybe they're coming back, but yeah, definitely books in a series. And then some kids talk about they really like that sort of sci-fi magical kind of stuff. And then, but Junie B. Jones, I think, is just a little girl and her adventures. My niece has read me a little bit of it. And it has these moral lessons in it. And as she pointed out to me, my mom doesn't like that she doesn't use proper grammar, which is
no,
true.
she doesn't.
Yeah, I know. And it's kind of funny. It's like you're trying to teach kids and you're using bad grammar. But anyway, yeah. So definitely series books, and either where there's like a kid hero at the center of the story. I mean, there probably always is, but a kid hero in the center of a story of like fiction series, or this kind of like magical sci-fi Game of Thrones type of stuff.
Right, although hopefully not actual Game of Thrones, because
yeah,
those...
right.
I mean,
put it down, kid version. Yeah,
right. That's definitely a series. It would take up a lot of time, but
yeah, it sparks a lot of questions.
Yeah. So I know you have a website. Can you share the address of your website as well as where people can interact with you on social media?
Sure. The website is katieburkeauthor.com, KatieBurke, author.com. And my social media pages there's Facebook, which is Katie Burke Author. Instagram is Katie Burke Author. And then Twitter is Katie Burke Auth, just not the OR. Those are my 3 places on social media.
Okay. Thank you for that. And Katie, we've talked about the book. We've talked about a variety of different topics. But is there anything at this point that you want to mention that we haven't talked about?
No, I don't think so. That was a really good chat.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I loved the book. It was so much fun. I love that the chapters are short, so you can sit down and read the whole thing, or you can sit down and read just a snippet here and there. It's so much fun. So thank you for taking the time to talk to me about this book.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to Katie once again for speaking to me about her book, Urban Playground, What Kids Say About Living in San Francisco. I think you can tell that I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was so much fun, and I think it would be great to read with kiddos. Katie mentions that it's not really a guidebook, and it's not. It's more of the children's experiences and maybe a chance for other children to read what it's like to either live in a different city than what they grew up in, or living in a city if they grew up in a rural area or a much smaller urban area. So it's a lot of fun. But I think also if there are more books that come out and you have children who are interested in traveling or obviously interested in what it's like to live in other places. But if they're interested in traveling, it might be kind of a fun thing to read before you go somewhere, or to read, on the plane as you're going there, or what have you. And not as a guide, but as let's find out what this is like. And maybe there's some things in here that we might want to see for ourselves. So I just think it's a really cool concept, and I enjoyed the book. Thank you again to Katie. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. If you are a fan of this podcast, it would be very, very appreciated if you could give us a review, whether that's written or 5-star. Very much helps us out to get this podcast out to other book lovers like yourselves. Also follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, GSMC Book Review. We'd love to hear from you. I especially would love to hear from you. Hope you're having a wonderful week. Hope you will join me again on Friday for another episode. And I definitely hope that your week involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.